now Tisha B'Av, Shavasa B'Tammuz, Tisha B'Av, Tzom Gedalia, and Asar B'Teves. And the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah raises a problem regarding the pasuk in Zechariah. The pasuk in Zechariah says Tzom Haravi, the fast of the fourth month. In other words, counting from Nisan, the fourth month is Tammuz, Shavasa B'Tammuz. We just observed that fast day. That was the day that the Romans broke through the walls of Yerushalayim, and according in the first Beis Hamikdash, according to the Bavli, the Babylonians broke through the walls of Yerushalayim on the 9th of Tammuz. But that's Tzom Haravi. So there's a fast day in the month of Tammuz, in a sense, on the day in which the enemy penetrated the walls of Jerusalem. And then Tzom HaChamishi, the fast of the fifth month, again counting from Nisan. So that is Tisha B'Av. Will be in about 2.5 weeks. And that's Tzom HaChamishi. And Tzom HaShvi, the fast of the seventh month, that's Tzom Gedalia. When Gedalia, who was, so to say, the governor, he was allowed by the Babylonians to have some authority in Eretz Yisrael. Even after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, there was some sort of Jewish government, and Gedalia was assassinated, and the Jewish people were overcome with many troubles as a result of that. So that's on the 3rd of Tishrei. And then we have Tzom HaSiri, which is the fast day on the date that the Babylonians surrounded Jerusalem in the war in which they took control of Yerushalayim and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. So the pasuk says these 4 fast days, Yiyul Beis Yehuda l'sason l'simcha, will be days of joy for the Jewish people, u'lemoadim tovim, and good holidays. Aval ha'emes v'hashalom ahavu, but love, truth, and peace. And the Gemara asks, there's an innate contradiction. On one hand, we identify these 4 days as days of fasting, days of mourning, days of crying out to God. On the other hand, we say, Yiluveish Yisrael, l'sason l'simcha, it will be days of joy, u'lemoadim tovim, and good holidays. How do we resolve this contradiction? And the Gemara says there are 3 different situations. Bizman sheyesh shalom, when there is peace, so it will be moadim tovim, it will be sason l'simcha, it will be days of joy when there's peace. When there are gzeros, when there are decrees against the Jewish people, so it's a fast day. But ein shalom ve'ein gzeros, if there is no peace, but there are no decrees against the Jewish people, ratzu misanim, ratzu ein misanim. Those who choose, if they choose to fast, they fast. If they choose not to fast, so they don't fast. And there is a dispute among the Rishonim, but Tisha B'Av, the Jewish people had accepted to fast, no matter what the situation is, because of all the terrible things that happened on Tisha B'Av. Except, of course, when there's peace, when there'll be real peace, so then Tisha B'Av will be a holiday. Now, the Rabbeinu Hananel, and many point out that Rashi seems to have the same opinion, explains, what does shalom mean? Bisman she'ei shalom. When there is peace, it'll be sasal simcha, it'll be days of joy. These 4 fast days will be days of joy. These will be the Moedim Tovim will be good holidays. What does it mean when there is peace? Rabbeinu Hananel, and many say Rashi has the same opinion, says, Bisman she'ei shalom, it means so long as the Beis Hamikdash is in existence. And when the Beis Hamikdash is in existence, so these fast days are holidays. According to that, during the time of the Second Temple, there were 4 additional holidays. Shavas Tammuz was a holiday. Tisha B'Av was a holiday. Tzon Gedalia was a holiday. And Asar B'Teves was a holiday. And when there is no peace, and when there are decrees, of course, it's a fast day. When there is no peace, and there are no decrees against the Jewish people, so most of the Mefarshim say that means like today. Okay, their today is a little different than our today. But in other words, there were periods of time when you did not have decrees against the Jewish people. But of course, the Beis Hamikdash was not rebuilt. So Ratzu Misanim, Ratzu Ein Misanim, sort of in that situation, it's sort of like a voluntary fast, except for Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is not a voluntary fast. Now, but Shalom, according to Rabbeinu Hananel, that means time of peace. That means when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt. So the question is, why is it that the Talmud, that the Gemara, identifies the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash with Bisman she'ei shalom, with a time when there is peace? Apparently, that the Beis Hamikdash is to be built not in the midst of war, not at a time that we're fighting a war. And the question, and we see to a certain degree that David HaMelech, King David, wanted to build the Beis Hamikdash, and God through the Navi, through the prophet, told him, "You cannot build the Beis Hamikdash. Your son Shlomo will build the Beis Hamikdash." Why? As the pasuk says in Divrei Yamim, "Harbe damim shafachta." You spilled a lot of blood. David was a warrior. His wars were sanctioned by God. These were wars of defense of the Jewish people. These were wars to a large degree. Not only he was allowed to go out to war, but these were wars that there was a mitzvah to fight. But nevertheless, David could not build the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because he was identified with war. And it's interesting, when did David ask for permission to build the Beis Hamikdash? He asked for permission when Hiniach Hashem mikol oyevav meisavid, when God gave him rest from all his enemies, at a moment that he was not involved in war. And it's interesting, Yerushalmi in Megillah says that we learn out from Pinchas, that Pinchas, the Yerushalmi Megillah says, how do I know that a Meshuach Muhammad was a Kohen who was appointed, so to say, to be the spiritual leader of the Jewish people? At the time, the Jewish people would go out to war. He would read the Parsha in the Torah, which would say who had to fight the war and who didn't have to fight the war. He would encourage the Jewish people and tell them that God was on their side and they didn't have to worry. And according to the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, his encouragement was not just limited to these psukim that he said, but he would continuously give them encouragement. They were fighting the war of God. And Yerushalmi says, how do we know that someone who is a Meshuach Muhammad can eventually become a Kohen Gadol? And he says, we learned it out from Pinchas. Pinchas, as we see in this week's Sedra, Pinchas was a Meshuach Muhammad. When the Jewish people went to war against Midian, it was Pinchas who went with them. He was their spiritual leader in the war. And ultimately, Pinchas becomes the Kohen Gadol. And many of the commentaries are somewhat troubled by the question of the Yerushalmi. How do we know that a Meshuach Muhammad, that someone who was anointed to be the Kohen, the main Kohen of the Jews going out to war, can eventually become the high priest, the high Kohen in the temple? How do we know that? And we learned it out from Pinchas. Why shouldn't he? Why is he any worse than any other Kohen? And Rav Zevin in his Sefer, Lor Halacha, he says, because of course we have Milchemes Mitzvah, we have wars of mitzvah, but war is not the goal. Sometimes war becomes necessary, but that's not the ideal. And the Beis HaMikdash was not to be identified with war or with death. Matter of fact, the halacha is that when the stones were cut for the Mizbeach, the stones were cut for the altar, they couldn't use metal to cut the stones. Other means had to be used to cut the stones. Why? Because metal is identified with weaponry, with weapons that kill people, with swords. And the Beis HaMikdash could not be identified with the shortening of people's lives. On the contrary, the purpose of the altar was to lengthen people's lives. In other words, special precaution had to be made to make sure that the Beis HaMikdash should not be an edifice or a monument identified with war, even victory of a war that was sanctioned according to halacha. Now, it's very interesting. And this is the reason why the question was raised about the Kohen Meshuach Muhammad, because he was identified with war. So someone could have suggested he couldn't be the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol was part and parcel of the Beis HaMikdash. He was in charge of the temple. And we do not want the temple to be identified with war. So because of that, the halacha was, when did it dawn on David that maybe he should build a Beis HaMikdash? When it was Hiniach lo Hashem mikol ha'yevav misaviv, when he had no longer enemies around him, when he no longer had to engage in war. Because the Beis HaMikdash had to be seen as a building of peace and not as a building of war. It could not even be seen as an edifice commemorating victory. And perhaps part of the reason could be identified with the fact that the Beis Hamikdash, ki beisi beis tefila yikarei l'chol ha'amim. The house of God, the Beis Hamikdash, had to be a house in which all nations could pray. Now, once I say that, I have to say that there was no economical perspective of the Beis Hamikdash. It's worshiping HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to be worshipped. Not in the way other nations practice their religion. They can practice their religion in their own temples. But even a non-Jew who wants to worship God in the manner that God wants, the temple had to be, in a sense, open to him to come to worship God as well. Beisi beis tefila yikarei l'chol ha'amim, an edifice that commemorates war, even the victory of a war, even a war sanctioned by the halacha, somehow could not play that role of beisi beis tefila yikarei l'chol ha'amim, that my house should be a house that all nations could come to worship God. Now, so a prerequisite for building the Beis Hamikdash is that we have to be at peace. And even David HaMelech understood that. So it's when it was Hiniach lo Hashem mikol oyevav misaviv, when it did not seem that he had to go to war anytime soon. So that was the time he thought was the proper time to perhaps build the Beis Hamikdash. And that's when he made the request, but it was rejected because of his past involvement in war. That's perhaps the reason why Bisman Sheyeh Shalom, the Talmud says, when there is peace, Yiyu l'sasan l'simcha, be days of joy, meaning when the Beis Hamikdash is in existence, because only when there is peace could the Beis Hamikdash be rebuilt. Now, now it's interesting though that in a time when there was no peace, in a time when there was peace, which according to Rashi and Rabbi Hananel means when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, so Yiyu l'sasan l'simcha, be days of joy. And Rashi says, what does it mean, Yiyu l'sasan l'simcha? So Rashi says, le'aser behesper v'tainis. When there'll be peace, when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, these days will be prohibited from fasting and giving eulogies. Now the question is, so Rashi, the Rambam, on the contrary, the Rambam says when there'll be peace, right? The Rambam understands peace, meaning when Mashiach comes. So these 4 fast days will no longer be fast days, but Yisason l'simcha moed and tovim will be happy holidays. So Rambam seems to understand it very literally. There'll be holidays. There will be celebration. Rashi seems to say, no, doesn't mean to be taken literally. There'll be days of celebration, days of joy. Rashi just says that it'll be days when one won't be allowed to fast, one won't be allowed to give eulogies. The emphasis is on what you won't be able to do, not on what you will do. And Rashi seems very, very difficult. The Navi in Zechariah, when he describes how these days are going to transform, he says they will no longer be days of fasting and of mourning, but they will be days of joy and of good holidays. So how can Rashi say that means that you won't be allowed to fast? It means a lot more than that. Good holidays. Sosam v'simcha. How could you say it just means? It just means that you won't be allowed to fast. And it seems that to a certain degree, the Baal HaTurim and Zechariah were somewhat troubled with it. But I have trouble with the answer that the Baal HaTurim seems to give. I want to suggest that, and we have other examples of that, one actually in this week's Sedra, that according to Rashi's opinion, when there will be days of joy, when there will be peace, meaning when the Beis Hamikdash will be in existence, so it will be holidays. It will be a voluntary holiday. But since it's a voluntary holiday, even if one does not celebrate, but he's not allowed to fast. There is a concept in Jewish law of a mitzvah kiyumis, of a mitzvah that's a voluntary mitzvah. And we have other examples. Matter of fact, in this week's Sedra, the Torah mentions, "V'yarashtem es haaretz v'yashavtem ba." You shall inherit the land and dwell therein. The mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. It's very famous, there's a machlokes between the Ramban and the Rambam. The Ramban lists the mitzvos that he felt that the Rambam failed to include in the Sefer Mitzvos. The Sefer Mitzvos was a book written by the Rambam where he delineates the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. And the Ramban says, why didn't he mention the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the mitzvah of living in the land of Israel? That mitzvah is mentioned in this week's portion. V'yirashtem es haaretz v'yashavtem ba. You shall take control of the land and dwell therein. Why didn't the Rambam include it? And the Rambam mentions the Sifri that our sages says, Shkula mitzvah Yishuv Eretz Yisrael keneged kol haTorah kula. Then on a certain level, the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of dwelling in the land of Israel, is equal to the whole Torah. So why is it that the Rambam didn't include it in the Sefer Mitzvahs? And my father said that the reason the Rambam didn't include it is because the Rambam's opinion, we see the Rambam says that it's better to live in Eretz Yisrael, even in a city that's full of idol worshippers, non-Jewish idol worshippers, than to live in Chutz La'aretz, than to live in exile in a city full of people that are observant and dedicated to God. Means, according the Rambam says explicitly, given the choice, obviously only under circumstances that we could, that if a person had a choice between living in Ramallah and living in Williamsburg or Lakewood or Borough Park or wherever it is, it's preferable to live in Ramallah. So how is it possible? So obviously the Rambam held it was a mitzvah. That it was a mitzvah. How could we say? So why didn't the Rambam include it among the 613 mitzvahs? And my father said the 600, it's based on something that Rabbi Chaim said. The 613 mitzvahs are obligatory mitzvahs. But the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, according to the Rambam, is a voluntary mitzvah. So I think these 4 fast days that will become holidays, there will be days of joy, days of celebration. But the celebration will be voluntary celebrations. It will be a mitzvah, but not a required mitzvah. And we have to understand why it should be that way. As far as the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, we could understand that the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is based on circumstances. Not everybody can pick up at any moment and move to the land of Israel. And each person's situation is different. 2 people could have the same circumstances, but one is able to move and one is not able to move. So it's a relative situation. So we can understand why the halacha made it a mitzvah kiyumis, a voluntary mitzvah. But the question is, the celebration, these 4 fast days that will become holidays when the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt, why should they be voluntary celebrations? And we find this concept, and actually, Rabbi Chaim suggested this concept of a voluntary mitzvah in regard to the mitzvah of davening. The Rambam's opinion is, we know that we are required to daven 3 times a day. Shacharis, Mincha, and Maariv. But that requirement is only a rabbinic requirement. Biblically, the Rambam says, one is required to daven once a day. And the Ramban says, no, there's no biblical requirement of davening except in time of trouble. And time of trouble, what's the mitzvah? Because it's brought down, there's a mitzvah that when an enemy attacks the Jewish people have to blow the trumpets. They have to blow the chatzotzros. They had to blow the chatzotzros. They had to blow the trumpets. So the Rambam says, no, it's the sounds of the trumpets, of the sounds to a certain degree of crying out to God. And accompanying with that, we have to daven, we have to pray to God because we are in trouble. But if there is no trouble, according to the Ramban, there is no biblical requirement of prayer. But Rabbi Chaim says that it goes without saying that even according to the Ramban, that there is no biblical requirement of prayer. But if one does pray, then he fulfills a biblical mitzvah. But Rabbi Chaim didn't say which biblical mitzvah he fulfills. I remember when my father accepted the job to come to Chicago. This was before we left New York. He was visited, was during the summer before we moved, by Rav Wernick. He was the mashgiach at the Hebrew Theological College. And I was listening by the door of the dining room. They were talking. And Rav Wernick, he was a Baal Musar. So he asked that question. He says, according to Reb Chaim, that according to the Ramban, there is a voluntary mitzvah. Reb Chaim said that according to the Ramban, even when it's not time of trouble, there is a voluntary mitzvah to daven. He says, what's the mitzvah? What's the mitzvah? A mitzvah is something that's mentioned in the Torah. What mitzvah are you fulfilling? Well, Reb Wernick was a Baal Musar and a very emotional person. So he suggested that the mitzvah is a mitzvah of love of God and fear of God. says when one davens, so he comes close to God. It's part of a love relationship. On the other hand, when someone asks God, he's overcome with awe. So he fulfills, to a certain degree, the mitzvah of love of God and fear of God. My father felt, no, it's included in vavadatem, in serving God. It's possible. However, I want to suggest something different, and it's based on something I've seen in my uncle's name, and I heard from my father also. I mentioned there is an argument whether biblically one is required to daven every day, or required to pray every day, or no, only in time of trouble you're required to pray. What's the argument? So the Ramban says you're only required to pray biblically in time of trouble, when there's an enemy at the gate. Perhaps you have a personal trouble. And the Rambam, Maimonides, says that you're required to pray every day. So my father and my uncle said that the truth is that everybody understands what is the essence of prayer. The essence of prayer is reacting to the fact that we are in trouble. But the Ramban's opinion is that you're only required to pray when you recognize that you're in trouble, when you see what the trouble is, when the enemy is at the gate. That's when you are required. But the Rambam's opinion is, man is always in trouble. We're just not aware of the trouble that we find ourselves in. So consequently, there's a biblical mitzvah of praying to God every day, because every day we are in trouble. There's a biblical requirement to pray every day. I want to suggest that according to the Ramban, the voluntary mitzvah, the Ramban doesn't disagree with the Rambam that man is always in trouble. Man is always in trouble, but we don't always recognize the trouble that we're in. But since the essence of prayer is reacting to the fact that we are in trouble and pleading with God for help. So when one prays without knowing what the trouble is, while he's not required to pray according to the Ramban biblically, but he fulfills the mitzvah skatam b'chatzotzros, the same mitzvah when you recognize you're in trouble, just that you're not required to. So, in other words, and it's very interesting. There is a question. Now, rabbinically, we're required to daven 3 times a day: Shacharis, the morning prayer; Mincha, the afternoon prayer; Maariv, the evening prayer. And originally, according to the way the Gemara paskins, the evening prayer was a voluntary prayer, Tfilas Arvis Rishus. And the Zohar raises the question. Now we know Shacharis is the prayer that is identified with Abraham, with Avram. Avram teaching Tfilas Shacharis. El Hamakom Asher Amad Sham B'Rishona. He went to the place that he stood in prayer the previous day. And if Vayash came Avram B'Boker, Avram got up in the morning. So the Torah identifies Avram with morning prayer. Yitzchak, Isaac is identified with the afternoon or late afternoon prayer. Isaac goes out to pray in the evening. Yaakov, Vayifga b'makom, Jacob, he's identified with the night prayer. So the question is, when Shacharis and Mincha were considered required prayers, Arvis was not considered, Maariv, the evening prayer was not considered a required prayer. So the question is, Yaakov is the Bechir Ha'avos. He was the chosen one of the patriarchs. Why should his prayer not be on the same level as the prayer of Abraham and Isaac? And the Zohar seems to say, explains it in Kabbalah terms, but the Zohar seems to say, on the contrary, it's because it's on a higher level that it's a voluntary prayer. And we need to understand that. The fact that it's on a higher level, therefore it's a voluntary prayer. How are we to understand that? Now, I think it could be understood with a disagreement between Reb Chaim, my great-grandfather, and my uncle. There is a discussion whether mitzvos srichos kavana or mitzvos ain't srichos kavana. Does one need to have intention when he does a mitzvah to fulfill the mitzvah or not? In other words, let's say someone hears the shofar blowing and he likes the sound of the shofar. He's not interested in the sound of the shofar because it's a mitzvah to hear it on Rosh Hashanah. But he likes the sound of the shofar. Does he fulfill? It's certainly not the best way to fulfill the mitzvah, but does he fulfill the requirement of hearing the shofar or not? That's a discussion in the Gemara. If we say to fulfill a mitzvah, you need intention to fulfill the mitzvah, so then you wouldn't require it. I'm listening to the shofar because I find it interesting. I like the sound. But if you need to have intention to fulfill the mitzvah, if you need kavanah, then you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah unless you focus that I am fulfilling a mitzvah now. I am fulfilling the command of God. And Reb Chaim said that just like in regard to most mitzvahs, some say you need kavanah, you need intention to fulfill the mitzvah. When you take a lulav of an esrog and you shake it, you have to have in mind, I'm taking this lulav of an esrog and shaking it because I want to fulfill the command of God to take the lulav of an esrog. So the same thing is true about davening also. In other words, there's a mitzvah of davening. I have to have in mind that I want to fulfill the mitzvah of davening. My uncle disagreed with Reb Chaim, and my uncle said, davening has to be an exception to the general rule. Yes, there are opinions that every mitzvah, that most mitzvahs, I take that back, most mitzvahs require intention. You have to fulfill it as an act of submission to the command of God. But when it comes to davening, a person shouldn't daven because I'm commanded to daven. Yes, you are commanded to daven. Certainly on a rabbinic level, you are required to daven. But you should daven because you want to daven. Because you want to make a connection with God. because you recognize your dependency upon God. And the truth is, I don't think that Reb Chaim would disagree with my uncle, but there are laws how one davens. In other words, a person could cry out to God, God help me. That's also davening. When someone's in trouble, he doesn't always have the time to say all of Shemona Esrei. And he cries out, help me, God. That's also a form of davening. But the mitzvah of davening is to daven in a particular manner. So when I daven, and I daven in the manner that is prescribed according to Jewish law, I have to have in mind that I'm doing it this way because I'm fulfilling the command of the mitzvah. So, but in any case, when it comes to davening, a person should daven not just because he's commanded to daven, but he davens because he wants to connect to God. He recognizes his dependency upon God. So that's why, but of all the tefillas, of all the shacharis, morning prayer, afternoon prayer, and evening prayer, this point is emphasized most with tefillas harvest, with the evening prayer, because the evening prayer is rishus, or at least was rishus, was not a required prayer. It was a voluntary prayer that demonstrated the essence of prayer, my desire to connect with God, my recognition of my dependency upon God, my recognition how I need God's help because I'm always in trouble. So more than any of the other tefillas, the Maariv prayer, the evening prayer, demonstrated that. Now, when it comes to the 4 fast days, eventually becoming holidays. So what are we celebrating when they become holidays? And why? Why did it become holidays? So the answer is because it's in the Radak in Skarya says that it's in recognition of the fact, it's a holiday because it's in recognition of the fact that we cried out to God, that we felt the Beis Hamikdash, we were lacking the temple, we felt the problems of our exile. So, commemorating that, these fast days will become holidays. In a sense, from the Radak, it appears that it's not only that we're celebrating the fact that our prayers and our cries were heard by God, but in a sense, we're celebrating also that we did cry out to God, that we did recognize our dependency upon God. You know, when the enemy is at the gate, we have different situations. When the enemy is at the gate, we recognize we're in trouble. When there are decrees against the Jewish people, when there is a Holocaust, you don't have to have much insight to recognize that we're in trouble. When the King of Spain in 1492 decreed that any Jew that stayed in Spain and did not adopt Christianity was to be killed. It was, we knew we were in trouble. It didn't require great insight. But Bizman, in a time, Shein Shalom, when there is no peace, when there is no Beis Hamikdash, when we are in exile, but Ein Zeros, and there are no decrees, like our time. The Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt. And to a large degree, we are in exile. Of course, we have something that for 1700 years, the Jewish people didn't have, a Jewish state. But nevertheless, the Beis HaMikdash isn't rebuilt. And most of the Jewish people are living in exile. And even the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, to a large degree, are living in an exile. But we don't have the decrees against the Jewish people that they had in the time of the Holocaust, which wasn't that long ago. And we got used to it. We got used to exile. Matter of fact, to a large degree, exile has become very comfortable. And we might not feel that we're in trouble. It's a time, ratzu misanim, ratzu ein misanim. Who chooses to fast? Today we've chosen to fast, but it was a voluntary choice that we as the people made. Who chooses to fast? Those who are able to penetrate the situation and see that even though there is no open trouble, we are in trouble. History moves very quickly. History moves very quickly. The Jews in Germany perhaps had more liberty than the Jews of any other country in Europe. And things can change. And we see how things are changing now in the street. Not so much about the Jewish people. But when things change about the world, the Jewish people are always the ones who suffer. So when it's Ratzum Mesanim, the fast is a voluntary fast. When there is trouble at the gates, when there are decrees against the Jewish people, it's a required fast. It's obvious that we're in trouble. But when it's a situation that we're used to, and sometimes there's even comfort in that situation, that shows recognition of our dependency upon God. Doesn't require much to recognize our dependency on God when the knife is at our throat. And I think to emphasize this point, that the greater recognition is the recognition when the trouble is not obvious. The greater recognition is recognizing our dependency upon God when it's not, when people could suggest that we're not in trouble. To emphasize that point, the celebration of that recognition and the celebration of the answering of the prayers of that recognition, according to Rashi, was also made as a voluntary prayer. In other words, to emphasize that the great recognition of God and of our dependency upon God is not when it's obvious, but when we're able to penetrate the situation and recognize that our dependency upon God and the help that God will give us. That's why the holiday, according to Rashi, will be a voluntary, it'll be a mitzvah kiyumis. It'll be a voluntary mitzvah, not a required mitzvah. But since it's a day of a voluntary celebration, a voluntary mitzvah celebrating, one is not allowed to fast on that day. Okay.
Thank you. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the group chat. I'm just going to put one out there so you have it. Should we make our own voluntary prayers in addition to standardized prayers to show that we are, I guess, mitzvah trichus kavana in regard to tefillah?
So what is suggested in Chazal, in other words, when a person's in trouble, he screams out. But if you have an appointment, let's say you need help from a king, if you have an appointment, that's probably the better time to do it. The Shacharis Mincha Maariv, that's the appointed time. We don't have to, but the person has special needs. So the special needs can be included in the Shemona Esrei, in the Shema Kolenu, or let's say if it has to do with Parnasa, earning a living, one can put it in the Baruch Aleinu. So it could be included. Obviously, if a person doesn't have the time to say that prayer, so any form of prayer is fine. But it's always better to include it in the form of prayer.
Okay, another question is, can we connect this logic about voluntary mitzvahs to explain the Torah's high esteem for women regarding the fact that they are not obligated at time-dependent mitzvahs?
It's certainly a woman who observes mitzvahs certainly has a reward for the observance of mitzvahs, and the mitzvah is considered to be on a very high level. But it's not considered an act of as much of an act of subservience as a required mitzvah.
Okay, and this question, is COVID-19 a reason not to fast, or only if one has symptoms? I don't know if that means Tisha B'Av.
Okay, all right. Well, that question can be understood in many different ways. One question is, because it says "Uzman sheyesh gzeros," when there are decrees. So it's a time that we have to fast. And COVID-19 is a reason to fast, and it's a reason for prayer. And I should add that perhaps these are part of the lessons that I always mention when it comes to paraduma. My uncle said, we don't understand the reasons why. We don't understand the reason how, but there's a what. And I think part of what we could learn from COVID-19 is that of our dependency upon God, that we can't assume that everything goes normal. We have to constantly be on God, and we have to constantly seek out God's help, and we're in need of God's help.
Okay. According to what Rabbi said during the share, could it be that the voluntary mitzvah of the Rambam to make Aliyah is because those who make Aliyah see the danger and want to be close to Hashem?
That's fine. That's certainly, being close to Hashem is certainly very good. The Kafta B'Ferach says that besides the Dusha, the sanctity that the land of Israel has for the special mitzvahs that are associated with Eretz Yisrael, Trumos and Maishros, there is another Dusha, sanctity of the presence of God. Now, God, I always mention, God is everywhere in the world, but in Eretz Yisrael, we become more sensitive to His presence. So it seems from the Gemara in Ksuvos that there is a greater mitzvah, although not a required mitzvah, in living in Yerushalayim than living in Eretz Yisrael. And the question is, why should there be a greater mitzvah? But the answer is that part of the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael is because in Eretz Yisrael, we can be more sensitive to the presence of God, because the Dusha is greater. That certainly would be true in Yerushalayim, in the land of Israel. So that's how we could say it.
Another question is, what did the builders of the Beis HaMikdash use if they couldn't use metal?
Okay, it's a discussion. It's a discussion in the Gemara. The Gemara discusses, but there might be other things. The use of the shamir was a certain type of worm that was able to cut through stone. So, but it's a question raised by the Gemara.
Okay, someone asked for a clarification. According to the Zohar, that greater is one who is commanded than one who does the mitzvah without being commanded. That prayer is an exception to that, according to the Zohar. Can you clarify that, please?
In other words, and the Zohar doesn't say that. The Zohar just says Maariv, Arvis, is considered to be on a higher level than Shacharis and Mincha because it's a voluntary prayer.
Oh, okay.
In other words, there's a relationship between the fact that it's a voluntary prayer and that it's on a higher level. Whether it's a voluntary prayer that makes it on a higher level or a higher level that makes it voluntary, okay, that's something to be discussed.
Okay. Thank you. I think I got all the questions here. Before we go, we want to wish a happy birthday to the Rabbi. May you have many happy, healthy returns. My father reminded me before the share to say that, but thank you. Happy birthday. Many happy, healthy returns. A lot of nachas and a lot of opportunities to teach Torah publicly and inspire others.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. For those who didn't know, in case Zoom isn't the best way, we've started streaming live on Facebook. I'll just put it right here so you can see it in case next week that's easier for you. It'll stream at that website over there. It'll be on YouTube later. Last week's share also was put on YouTube last Sunday. So thank you all for joining and have a good week.